Thanks for having me here, and I want to give a special thanks to Bonnie Norlander for organizing this and for inviting me to speak. So my name is Lynnette Miranda. I am a curator, educator, and organizer based in Kansas City, Missouri. Although I've heard great things about Portland, Maine, its art community and its energy, this is my first time here. When Bonnie asked me to speak, I wasn't really sure what I could share with you all since I'm not familiar with the context of Portland's art ecosystem or its publics. However, I have experience working with publics, and I know the work, commitment, knowledge, and most of all the trust it takes to work in the public sphere. So today we've been talking a lot about the public sphere and really thinking about public space. And so a lot of what I will talk about will really be about publics and working with people. And I know we've touched on that in individual presentations and workshops, but that's sort of going to be my focus. And I'm going to start off with sharing a story, and most of the slides are just sort of for show, so I'm going to put it on play. And it's mostly like my exhibition making practice, but I used to work at Creative Time in New York, which is a public arts organization, and I'm going to read a little bit. All right. So I worked in the arts for about 8 years, working alongside artists and audiences. I was a full-time studio assistant for the artist Nick Cave in Chicago. I worked in various capacities for museum education departments at the Art Institute of Chicago and the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Then, after graduate school, I was the manager of educational initiatives at Art 21, and most recently, I was a summit coordinator at Creative Time, an artist-centered public arts organization in New York City. It was my experience at Creative Time that bridged my passion for working with artists and with audiences through the production of public projects. As an intern, I assisted with Suzanne Lacey's Between the Door and the Street, her first public project in New York City, which took place on the stoops of people's homes along a Brooklyn street. I later joined Creative Time as a coordinator of the Creative Time Summit, an international conference exploring the intersection of arts and politics. And I worked on both iterations of Creative Time's summit titled The Curriculum in 2015, one at the Venice Biennale and one at the Boys and Girls High School in Bed-Stuy, New York, which is a neighborhood in Brooklyn, predominantly black and brown neighborhood. It's a really big neighborhood in Brooklyn, so it varies. It was on the heels of the conference at the Venice Biennale that we began organizing the summit in Brooklyn, with only 3.5 months to work with. As I mentioned, this is an annual conference, but this year the organization felt the need to host a New York version for our local audiences. Previously, the summit had been hosted at the New York Public Library and New York University's Skirball Center, both venues designated for conferences and presentations. But on the suggestion of the former director, it was decided that it would be hosted in a public high school building situated in this predominantly brown and black neighborhood that houses at least 3 separate schools. At the beginning of the process, it started to feel as we were plopping our content from Venice into Brooklyn. And for me personally, it felt like we were colonizing a space for our own gain. We were going to bring radical thinking into, quote unquote, a failing public school, using the school as a background for our work, an illustration of the real world issues, or like curators say, real world implications. It was supposed to be, sort of edgy and cool that we were going into Brooklyn. So, in early September, the acting director asked everyone during a staff meeting to name a highlight from the summer and an anxiety going into the fall. So, I piped up and expressed concerns about going into Bed-Stuy for this project that I would personally be directly working on. Play this again because I know those went really fast. And so I asked if there was a deeper reason we were hosting it there, how we planned on working with the school's immediate community, and ultimately what our goals were in doing so. 2 fellow women of color echoed similar anxieties, including my friend and Creative Time's former engagement and education manager, Suhaili Bautista Carolina. In private meetings, Suhaili and I would push this issue like broken records, both together and independently. For nearly 4 weeks, we were brushed off by several members of the leadership. It wasn't until the Creative Time team did a site visit to the school. 2 principals from the two schools we were partnering shared similar concerns and explicitly stated that they were not interested in being a rental venue, but instead wanted their students to engage with our content and programs. Within the week, Suhaili was asked to develop strategies for community engagement for an event that was 2 months and maybe a couple weeks away. I was asked to help Suhaili in efforts and be the liaison between the engagement department and the summit team. In addition to our smart administrative strategies to advocate and promote better content within the summit's official program, Suhaili and I led a 6-week after-school arts program about activism and public art, specifically in the Black Panthers Party and the Young Lords Party, with a group of students from both high schools. So that was like on top of the conference that I had to organize. I'm proud of the end result, but with more time we could have had greater impact, included more voices. While it may seem like it was a smooth sailing after this shift that I mentioned, it wasn't. Every step of the way was a tiny battle for resources and time. At one point, Suhaili and I wanted to include 4 additional workshop roundtable programs by artists and cultural workers in the neighborhood, or doing community-based work in similar neighborhoods. And I was told on one end that we can only choose 2 due to budget constraints. And just to give you an idea, each participant was, receiving maybe a couple $100, so it would have been less than $1,000 total. Meanwhile, on Suhaili's end, they were limiting the number of complimentary tickets for community members to attend the conference, even though realistically we don't make any profit from ticket sales. I think it covers like food. So Suhaili and I in a conversation shared this information with one another and realized that, she had seen that they had received a larger grant above $10,000. I don't remember the exact amount, specifically for community engagement for this program. And, the numbers didn't really add up because she noticed that it was like our organization was claiming that it was for community tickets. And we were sort of being limited in terms of content and given the excuse about budget. So as a team, we strategically talked about this, and she met with higher-ups and specifically asked in a meeting about her department why, about this grant and why the funds couldn't be used for the additional workshops and for more complimentary tickets. I mean, that's not a really ridiculous ask, that's just like a little bit more. And since they didn't have a great answer, they allowed us to move forward with all the workshops. That's just like one of many examples. But I've held many positions in a range of institutions, from being a museum educator at an encyclopedic museum, to an administrator at a public arts organization, to currently an exhibition curator at a non-collecting organization supporting emerging artists. In each institution, the idea of access is celebrated and encouraged. We want publics to have access to objects of art, craft, and cultural heritage. We want publics to engage with enlightening ideas of creatives and intellectuals, both historical and contemporary. A common mistake that we make is relying on simple invitations that, between the lines, say, "Our doors are open, we have great programs, therefore you should want to come in." Experiences such as the one at Creative Time often occur because I'm one of few, if not sometimes only, the only person of color that's in predominantly white institutions where there is a practice of tokenism thinly veiled under the coded language of access, diversity, and opportunity. And so those things happen to me a lot, and I just can't help but have to ask questions. That's just like part of my practice. It makes for a very difficult workplace if they're not open to that. And I want to share this story with you because I believe that social change and progress, long-lasting change, is more effective through modes of administration and holistic infrastructure process, not only through programs, product, which is oftentimes we want to solve issues of change, and I'm one who is really invested in artists who engage with politics and social practice. But I know that administration is not the sexiest thing to talk about, and we know that it's often not very cool, sexy work either. But it is our invisible labor to support artists and audiences through fundraising, project management, a million Excel spreadsheets that keep it all together, that is critical to the success of our work as a field. So I want to share a growing list of terms that I've been working on defining for myself and that have evolved into specific strategies for my own work. What I want you all to consider, more than my own strategies, is how you define these terms for yourself, and for your community, and for your context. Many of you have been working in the field of public art for a long time, and have your own experiences and knowledge that inform your work. But maybe you haven't had the moment to distill and articulate them for yourselves. I know that I often can't find that moment in my practice. For me, the goal of this list is to think critically and be intentional about the work that I do, and the words that I use to describe it. And just a note, putting pictures of conferences is pretty boring, and that's most of the work I've done before the exhibition. So I just thought I'd share a few of the exhibitions I've worked on and some of the public programs and how I'm interested in gathering people in space over food and activities. So these don't really have they have a lot to do with my strategies because I still employ them in the gallery space, but they're just for fun. So audience, community, and what I call responding to context. Who is your audience? What community do you operate within? Are they the same group? Oftentimes we have a bad habit of conflating these two words. The distinction is important for me. For example, because the gallery that I work in, this one, is located in a gentrifying Mexican neighborhood. While I'm absolutely interested in engaging those communities, my goal is to program for an organization whose primary audience are artists. While the West Side neighborhood is the community I'm situated within, my audience are artists. Once I clearly defined that, I shifted my efforts to include more artists of color in my outreach, both from in that community and outside of it, and in my programs. Now, I alone can't shift the institution's entire mission to accommodate the community we're in. Even if I wanted to, at the time that I arrived in Kansas City, didn't have the knowledge of the community, its history, or a relationship with it at all. So instead, I decided to start where I knew I could make an impact, by speaking to and learning from the local artists of color who felt marginalized and isolated from that art community in Kansas City. This is one of many audiences I work with, but by identifying the various groups I interact with, I can begin to thoughtfully engage with each through different methods. So basically it's not one size fits all. So a couple of things that I often, and I have these written down not just for the presentation, I actually go back to it. I'm a really big nerd, so I write missions for myself and goals. But identify your audience beyond demographics, understand why they're interested in your work and why they could be interested in your work. What is their investment and what is your investment in them? What resources and knowledge are you providing to your primary audience? How are you contributing to the cultural landscape of that context? What new conversations are you starting? How can these conversations continue and eventually turn into action? Speaking of audience and community, diversity. I often hear individuals use the word community about their public project or any program really, and when they say community, they really mean brown and black communities. They use community and diversity almost interchangeably, as if diversity is only about race and ethnicity. We have to remember, myself included, that diversity includes age, race, ethnicity, class, gender, ability, and so on. The work of racial diversity, for example, is directly tied to a historical legacy of slavery and colonialism in and by the United States. The influence and lineage of that history infiltrates our policies, our systems, and institutions, from Jim Crow law to a broken criminal system, justice system. Arts and cultural workers must acknowledge this fact before we can move into finding strategies and solutions, because this work is harder and more time-consuming than simply extending our well-intentioned hand. Our field, especially, doesn't give us time to do deep work. Instead, we are driven by production and productivity, measured by how many exhibitions and programs we're able to complete, how many diverse attendees there were in that program. And I say this from working in many institutions that have great employees and do great work. So it's not just pinpointing, pointing fingers. I've been part of those systems and I continue to be part of those systems. So we can't do meaningful work this way. This work must start internally. If we aren't willing to invest in deep work, in general, then how are we even ready to invest in something like diversity and equity? This work, like all great work, takes depth, focus, and time. And diversity specifically must be a consideration into every part of our processes and at all levels of our institutions. Mostly, this work takes humility and knowing our limitations in order to overcome them or find new paths to solutions. The next thing is collaboration, risk, and trust. And we've talked a lot about collaboration throughout. So I often ask myself, who are the stakeholders of my project? Artists, audiences, educators, curators, administrators, funders, government, and so on. And even you can even break that down further, right? They're all stakeholders of many of our projects. But I like to think of them as collaborators with various levels of investment and commitment. While I know the reality of working with difficult partners and stakeholders, and I start from a point of optimism in hopes of shifting pre-existing assumptions about the people and organizations we work with. So even though I'm very critical, it's always important to give everybody a chance and sort of come to the table. So some things I always go back to is trust in your collaborators by explicitly sharing the goals and expectations you have for yourself and of them, and ask for them to share those with you. Often, I ask my artists to come to our first meeting about any exhibition or project we're working on with their personal and professional goals. What are you trying to get out of this experience? I would rather know that they might be prioritizing something like getting press, for example, while I might be prioritizing audience engagement. This way we can help each other achieve our goals by aligning our shared vision for a project without going against one another simply because of bad communication. So if I'm working with other artists or members of my community, I often think about these, I literally pulled these from like a kind of sheet that I have that I look at for myself. So knowing when to step up and lead, knowing when to step back and listen. Listening attentively and thoughtfully to the needs and wants of your collaborators and of yourself. Push and challenge your collaborators to be critical and ask themselves the question, why, about everything. Knowing when you need to say no. Shared decision-making power is important. Give your collaborators agency to lead and make those decisions. Ask your collaborators to explicitly push you and challenge you. This opens up a channel of communication that says, I might not be right at every moment, so let me know when you have a better idea. Let your collaborators be in control of their own vision and ask them to share that with you so you can support their vision and vice versa. I won't go into this too much. I'm sort of reaching the end, but when you establish a solid foundation for working with others that allows new ideas and processes, you've built trust. This will lead you into taking more risk with your work and knowing that things won't fall apart. This is my favorite part of curating, working with artists and education, not knowing what the final outcome will be. I always have an idea, but this is actually a fun fact. Most of the times in all the exhibitions that sort of went through the slide, I didn't know what pieces were going to be in the show until about a week before the opening, because I trust that my artists will bring amazing work that will be even better than, amazing new work, because I've given them agency, empowered them, and trusted their vision. And honestly, it's never been an issue, it's never disappointed. But this only works because of accountability, transparency, and a culture of reciprocity. So accountability is really important in collaboration for me. So setting those goals and expectations, like I mentioned, also holding each other accountable, being clear and being honest, and being transparent about my process and asking them to do the same about their process. So I share all of this very unsexy process because I think that as organizers, we have a responsibility to make artists and art accessible to all. From starting out as a studio assistant for Nick Cave to working at visionary artist-centered organizations such as Art21 and Creative Time, I believe that artists inspire us to thoughtfully appreciate the overlooked, energize us to question the familiar, and help us imagine the possibilities for the unknown. Artists engage with the world around them. They contend with questions and ideas about people, culture, society, and the world at large. And as a curator, I've often said, I don't curate objects, I curate artists and artistic practice in my exhibitions, meaning that I work with artists and embrace process to develop and produce projects. I spent 8 years working with artists from emerging to established, specifically supporting their work in the public. In my experience, artists are catalysts for new thinking and change, but they are also important collaborators to help deepen already existing ideas and narratives. There is an assumption by the mainstream that art is individualistic, from how we experience it to how we create it. Yet, the reality is that art is experienced and created in and with community. Artists matter because they allow us to build community with them, and they embody the collective. So I end with this. We need to be artists and educators in the way that we organize, project manage, and administrate in order to support long-lasting change and progress. Thank you.